Gathered for the very first work session of 2022. For those joining us virtually, this is Katie Crystal, the chair of the county board, joined by my colleagues in full force, Ms. Garvey, Mr. DeFerenti, Vice Chairman Dorsey, and Mr. Carantonis. We are assembled today to talk about a stormwater utility implementation here in Arlington. And I'll say just a word, this is in some ways precipitated, no pun intended, by a series of conversations and robust community engagement, really dating back to, well, I'm sure before, but certainly I think for our community coming to light with the July floods back in 2019, which I think really helped many of us understand, at least those of us who are lay people, understand the need for significant new infrastructure investments in stormwater, but also changes in not only how we fund those things, but how we assign the obligations and burdens of funding those things to make sure that we are not only doing that as equitably as possible, but also trying to incentivize the changes in behaviors for greater permeable surface throughout Arlington County. So this is, I think, a pretty consequential potential change in how we fund and charge for stormwater management within Arlington County. And I will say no further. I'll turn it over to our manager to introduce what I think is a pretty extensive interdepartmental team on this.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. Since receiving direction from the board to pursue the stormwater utility last year, we've been hard at work looking at technical and financial analysis of what a rate structure could look like, and we're here to present our initial findings and some rate structure options for you to review. And as you know, as you just mentioned, the policy intent behind the utility is to really have an equitable cost recovery to help ensure that everyone pays their fair share of the stormwater costs based on what their property contributes to the system. You know, currently county residents and businesses contribute via the sanitary district rate, which is based on real property values and not correlated to impervious surface. This change that we're talking about is going to affect every property owner in the county. And for some, like churches and nonprofits, they will pay this fee for the first time. So we're ready to kick off engagement on the rate structure and wanted to have this work session as a way to get started. And if things go according to plan, we're only 17 months away from implementation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Moon, who is here in person, and Tyler Smith, who is here virtually for the presentation. Mike?
Welcome, Mr. Moon.
Thanks. Thanks for being here today for the stormwater utility implementation update. This frames the agenda. Next slide. This frames the agenda we plan to discuss today with the county board and will guide the discussions to provide an update that highlights the opportunities of a stormwater utility and what it provides, and also be transparent on some of the challenges that the utility will present as we start the engagement process with the public and stakeholders. We'll be seeking input on certain aspects of the program, a recommended utility fee structure, along with the option to charge a base charge similar to what has recently been included in our water and sewer utility billing to cover the cost of administration and billing. A multifamily residential customer class option is also included to mitigate some of the impacts that you'll be explained on garden-style apartments and that type of structure in our community. And then the design elements of a credit program that is required by the state. Next slide. As Mark alluded to, at the adoption of the FY22 budget, the county board directed staff to move into phase 2, the implementation phase of the stormwater utility project. Specifically, this phase will include stakeholder outreach and public engagement. It will also specifically address how we develop the rate structure. And last but not least, there will also be lots of work to implement the utility, including GIS updates, the development of a credit program, and drafting processes, policies, and procedures, and billing work, and developing technology tools that will be needed. The timeline is aggressive and could be pushed to FY25 if engagement rate design becomes complex, if either of those elements become complex and as we move into them. With that, I'm going to turn over the bulk of the presentation to Tyler Smith.
Thanks, Mike. To date, we have completed phase 1, which included a feasibility analysis to examine the impacts of moving to a stormwater utility. The deliverable included a comprehensive final report that can be viewed on the county's website. We have also completed what we're calling phase 2A, which was an add-on to the feasibility study to examine additional rate options, recommendations for billing, and credit program options. This work was led by Raftellus, an outside consultant who also led the county's recent water sewer rate study. And with us today virtually is Henrietta Locklear and Jennifer Tavantas representing Raftellus. On the county side, the core team also includes Krista Abel and Demetra McBride. We're now entering phase 2B, the engagement and implementation phase. Our consultant, Raftellus, will once again be managing the implementation process for the county. Next slide. So what is a stormwater utility? A stormwater utility is a funding mechanism to pay for the county's stormwater management program. Instead of funding the program through the sanitary district tax add-on, which is the current model and based on property's assessed value, the program would be funded based on each property's measured impervious area. The county would charge properties a user fee based on their usage of the stormwater system, estimated by the impervious square footage of their property. Next slide. The stormwater utility would fund the same programs currently funded by the sanitary district tax now and that are listed on this slide. Our water quality and regulatory program, the infrastructure capital program that is critical to ensure capacity of our stormwater sewers, and management and maintenance of approximately 400 miles of storm sewer pipe. Plus, it would also fund the overhead costs required to manage the stormwater utility, which is preliminarily estimated at $320,000 a year and 2.5 FTEs. It would also fund a credit program, which would be required by state code. I should note, however, as we continue to expand the stormwater capital program, the size of the program the utility fee would fund would be influenced by CIP decisions. Next slide. This slide illustrates what we mean by impervious area. It's the portion of the property that is covered with hard surfaces that doesn't let rainwater soak into the ground. So the roof, patio, and walkway are all examples and illustrated on this slide in yellow. To measure impervious area on each parcel in the county, we rely on GIS imagery to calculate the square footage. The charge would be based on a unit of measurement called an ERU, or equivalent residential unit. It is estimated for Arlington as the median amount of impervious square footage for a single-family home. In Arlington, 1 ERU equals 2,400 square feet. This slide goes through some of the benefits of funding the program through a utility model. Fees are set based on the demand each property places on the system, measured by impervious area. Ultimately, this creates a fair distribution of the cost of the program. In Arlington, there is a weak correlation between assessed value, the method by which we determine tax burden now, and impervious area, which means under the current funding model, the tax burden is not aligned with usage of the system. This lack of correlation, though, will also mean that under a utility, you could have similar homes in terms of assessments, but different cost burdens under a utility based on differences in impervious areas, such as patios and driveways. Under a utility model, currently exempt properties like the federal government, nonprofits, and places of worship will pay based on the burden these properties are placing on the system. This funding model is in alignment also with industry trends. 19 of 21 VAMPS jurisdictions fund their stormwater programs through a utility model. The rate structure is not designed to be an incentive program, but as a cost recovery mechanism based on runoff contributed by each parcel. This results in an equitable way to distribute costs of the stormwater management. You'll see later in the presentation, the annual rates we're discussing are not significant enough to incentivize homeowners to reduce impervious surfaces, such as removing or converting driveways and patios. Next slide. But there's also some considerations that we need to be mindful of as we go through this implementation. While more of a fair distribution, the cost burden will shift to single-family residential and other properties that have large impervious footprints, like strip retail and garden-style apartments. Nonprofits and places of worship, which could be currently exempt under the tax model, would need to pay under a utility model, which could be a challenge for some. And federal properties that hold an MS4 permit would be exempt under a utility fee model. There are some administrative considerations as well. A credit program will be required by state code, and there will be ongoing administrative costs to implement the utility. This slide addresses the 4 equity questions as it relates to this project. Who benefits, who is burdened, who's missing, and how do we know? Who benefits? Non-single family residential high-rise properties and high-rise multifamily with smaller impervious footprints. Who is burdened? 68% of single-family residential will see an increase in their burden, but it's a modest increase at an average of $58. However, previously exempt properties such as the federal government, places of worship, and nonprofits will see an increase as they were paying $0 previously. And last but not least, non-single family residential low-rise buildings such as strip retail and garden-style apartments see a burden increase. Who is missing? Multifamily renters are indirect customers of this utility. The property owners would be receiving the utility bill on their real estate tax bill. It is unclear what the pass-through to tenants would be. And how do we know? The analysis we will walk you through in the next few slides demonstrates the GIS parcel level analysis and bigger picture analysis Reftelis, our consultant, has completed to support these conclusions. This slide shows the fee structure options that we looked at during the feasibility study. On the left side for single family homes, we looked at a simple rate structure where each property would be charged a flat charge or 1 ERU per property. And we looked at tiered options where smaller footprint properties would be charged less than homes with more impervious area. And lastly, we looked at a tiered with a cap model where above a threshold, single family homes would be charged for their measured square footage impervious area on their property. On the non-single family residential side, or what we call NSFR, which includes apartments, condos, and commercial real estate, we would bill each property based on the measured square footage of impervious area. Since each property's characteristics are so unique in the NSFR space, it is hard to create tiers with fees assigned. Therefore, we charge based on the impervious characteristics unique to each property. This slide shows examples of single-family homes and what their burden would look like under the 3 fee structures we examined. This is a good point to note that the rates are based on the feasibility study, and as we finalize the rate model in this phase and update the GIS information, these rates will change slightly. For the smallest impervious home, you can see compared to the sanitary district tax of $71.35, their burden goes up under each fee structure, but is the highest under the flat fee. Under the flat fee that treats every property the same, the smallest example doesn't get the benefit of having less impervious area. For the average property, their fee would be the highest under the 3 tiers option, but if we add the cap, their burden would go down slightly. And the example of the property above 4,800 square feet is where you can really see the benefit of 3 tiers with a cap. The property sees a large benefit under a flat fee model since their impervious area is so far above the median of 2,400 square feet, but their burden increases compared to the sanitary district tax when they are billed under the 3 tiers of the cap model. These examples really illustrate why we are recommending we bill single-family homes under the 3 tiers of the cap model. This slide illustrates in more detail the tiered with a cap fee structure, which we are recommending for Arlington because we think it is the most fair in that it places the burden for single-family homes where the runoff is created. The tiered with a cap approach would bill homes with less than or equal to 1,600 square feet of impervious area 0.6 ERU and includes 33% of properties. The majority of homes, or almost 60%, fall into Tier 2 and would be charged 1 ERU. Tier 3 is for larger impervious footprint homes between 3,600 and 4,800 square feet and would be charged 1.7 ERU. Above 4,800 square feet, your home no longer gets the benefit of being in a tier and you are charged like non-single family residential properties. It's relatively small amount of properties at just 2%, but you can see in the distribution graph above with the right side tail that they would have a wide range in impervious footprint. Although 2% is not very large and isn't necessarily a large financial driver, we do think it's important for this larger impervious area homes to pay their fair share. Non-single family residential, as mentioned earlier, includes both commercial and multifamily property types and would be billed based on the measured square footage unique to their property. Properties with MS4 permits would be exempt per state code. In Arlington, there are 5 non-county properties. Nonprofits and places of worship are not exempt and would be charged. 539 properties fall into this category. Rates based on impervious shift the burden to properties with large parking lots and strip retail and multifamily housing that is more linear, like garden-style apartments, as opposed to high-rise. There are additional options for fee structures we could consider as well. We could add a base charge into our fee structure. This would be a flat fee per parcel that would capture costs for expenses that aren't related to runoff, like street sweeping and administrative costs. This is similar to the base fee we charge under the water sewer rate. During Phase 2B, we also looked at options to reduce the burden slightly on garden-style apartments, which tend to be our more affordable housing types. The outcome of that analysis was an option we could consider called the multifamily or MFR customer class. If this class is added, instead of measuring the impervious area on each parcel, we would total the impervious area across the entire class and divide by the total number of housing units. This would result in a per unit ERU charge of 0.18. Next slide. Similar to the option we looked at for single-family homes that charged a flat fee for every home, adding the MFR customer class would charge each unit a flat charge, which has a similar result to the single-family residential flat tier. It would result in a decrease in burden for properties that have more impervious area, in this case, garden-style apartments, and increase the burden for high-rise or more vertical structures as compared to the recommended fee structure. Overall, garden-style apartments would still increase compared to the sanitary district tax, but this would alleviate some of the burden. Adding the MFR customer class will create administrative work ongoing and during implementation. We would need to do a survey to complete our data set on units in each building and also consider adding a townhomes class to our rate structure to make the rate structure more defensible. Alexandria also has a utility billing fee structure that bills condos and townhomes as separate customer classes. This slide summarizes the burden shifts we just discussed. There's a weak relationship between taxable value and impervious area, which means that going from the tax to the fee has wide-ranging impacts. When comparing the three single-family residential rate structures we've mentioned previously, the flat rate treats all residential properties the same. The tiered rate allows smaller impervious properties a small break, and tiered with a cap places more burden on the largest impervious properties. And the apartments condos options, the MFR customer class we just discussed, doesn't have a large impact on single family residential properties. Next slide. This slide shows some of the burden shifts that occur between the property classes comparing the sanitary district tax to the utility tiered with a cap. The amount of revenue we need to fund the program under utility doesn't change. In general, the size of the pie doesn't change, but who is contributing more funding to the program does. Single family residential increases from 37% to 44% due to the amount of runoff that single-family homes contribute to the stormwater system. NSFR properties increase as well from 27% to 35%. And lastly, apartments and condo properties decrease from 36% to 21%. But what happens within each slice of this pie is what is interesting, and we'll get into some of those nuances in a few slides. Under utility, the burden on multifamily residential would decrease. This slide takes a look at the construction pipeline for multifamily in the county and uses current assessment data to estimate the sanitary district tax revenue that would be generated from these properties in the future. Compared to the utility revenue under the MFR option, you could see that, that we estimate they would generate approximately 65% less revenue, as these developments tend to be more vertical, high-rise structure, and thus produce less runoff than more sprawling developments. Next slide. On the next few slides, we'll take a look at the nuances within each property class and how burden is shifting and who is impacted. Weak relationship between taxable value and impervious area means that going from a tax to a fee has wide-ranging impacts for single-family homes. As a whole, 68% of single-family homes will see an increase in their bill compared to the sanitary district tax. The majority of homes will fall into Tier 2 and be charged for 1 ERU, or $188.15. But the average increase is only $58. The worst case example would be a $5 million property in the county, which would more than double to a fee of over $2,000. The heat map on the right side of this slide shows in red where properties are increasing their burden more than 100%, and in green where bills are decreasing more than 35%. This slide shows the Arlington sanitary district tax compared to our neighboring jurisdictions. Under the current structure, Arlington fees are only higher than Prince William. The star in this slide shows where Arlington would fall if we were implementing the utility now. We would move up a little bit above the city of Fairfax. We should note all of the jurisdictions on this slide bill for their stormwater programs as a utility, except Arlington, Fairfax County, and Fairfax City. And Fairfax City recently adopted utility to go into effect in FY23. Previously tax-exempt properties under the sanitary district tax will no longer be exempt from paying a stormwater fee per state code. There are 539 properties that fall into this category. These types of properties include places of worship, which can include cemeteries, federal properties, and other nonprofits and properties with tax exemptions. These properties would generate approximately 16% of the stormwater revenue for the program, driven primarily by federal government properties. Places of worship will see an average bill of almost $1,600. Next slide. Non-single family residential, if you exclude condos and apartments, is going up as a whole. But when you look at what is driving that, it tends to be low-rise commercial properties with lots of parking. These types of properties like strip retail will tend to experience an increase compared to tax. This is what is driving the burden up, where high-rise properties with a small footprint will in general experience a decrease compared to the tax. Army Navy Country Club will experience the biggest increase in this customer class. The next two slides take a look at the multifamily residential customer class. This slide looks at impacts under the recommended baseline scenario, which treats MFR properties the same as other commercial properties and bills each property based on their measured impervious area. So again, you see here that switching from the tax to the fee, property charges tend to decrease for high-value properties with small footprints, like high-rise, and you can see that along the corridor here in this map. An increase for low-value properties with large footprints, like garden-style apartments, and you can see that in the heat map along Columbia Pike with the red and orange colors. Next slide. This slide also shows the MFR properties, but this shows the MFR option, where instead of billing the properties like other non-single family residential properties, we would bill them a flat per unit charge based on the total impervious area for the entire customer class. This option blunts some of the impacts noted on the previous slide, so garden-style apartments are not as adversely impacted by the switch from the tax to the fee. You can see this along Columbia Pike, where instead of red in the heat map, you now see oranges and yellows. Next slide. To round out the discussion on burden impacts of moving to a utility, we're going to look at a few examples. The first example is a block in the 22207 neighborhood in Arlington. You can see three different parcels we are looking at, A, B, and C. This example really highlights that impervious area does not correlate at all with assessed value, as the most expensive homes see the biggest drop under the utility, house C in this example, and the least expensive home, home A, sees their burden increase. This has become because home A has a large patio and driveway. Next slide. This is the same example, but provides a street view of the property. Next slide. This next example is a block in the 22202 neighborhood. Again, we see that the most expensive home, home C, does not have the biggest utility fee. Home B, which has more impervious area, is bumped up to the third tier and charged more. Next slide. Again, a street view to provide some reference. This example illustrates impacts to garden-style apartments by showing the impact to the Barcroft apartments. You can see the significant impact going from $23,000 to $93,000 under the recommended utility fee. If we add in the per unit MFR option, that burden shift would be significantly lessened. The reason burden shifts to this customer properties, this class of properties, is due to the sprawling nature of the parcel. Here's another garden-style apartment example. Again, you can see the same trend with a significant jump from the sanitary district tax to the recommended utility fee. The burden increase is lessened when you add the MFR option. Next slide. This example shows a high-rise apartment complex example where you can see the opposite trend because of the vertical nature of the property. Under the recommended utility fee, the burden would decrease. And when you add an MFR option, it increases slightly compared to the recommended utility. This example shows an example of strip retail with a large parking lot. You can see under the utility, there's significant increase compared to the sanitary district tax. Next slide. This example shows more of a vertical, non-single family residential example where the recommended utility fee would decrease compared to the sanitary district tax. Next slide. And this example shows St. Charles, a place of worship in the county. And you can see here where they're going from zero in their current sanitary district tax, since they're exempt, to a recommended utility fee of over $7,000. So moving into the credit program, under state code, we are required to offer a credit program. This slide gives you an overview of what the design of a good credit program would aim to do. We would want the program to help support water quality, meet regulatory mandates, create private opportunities that support the county's goals, and promote private sector awareness and voluntary behavior. A good credit program will increase the public perception of the program and buy-in. It will encourage customers to implement and maintain BMPs and participate in activities that improve environmental quality. And they typically have a low revenue impact to the program. Credit programs do increase workload. Participation can be hard to predict, and if not done correctly, they may not correlate with BMP impact or could conflict with the LDA program. This slide shows some examples of the types of credits that some jurisdictions offer. If you participate in the credit program, you will receive a discount on your bill. The credit program will be designed during implementation and will incorporate stakeholder feedback. Because of the potential for conflicting with the LDA program and the increases in administrative work, we will be recommending a simple credit program so that we can better devote resources to LDA 2.0, which we believe will have a much greater impact on reducing runoff. Typical credits are not large enough that they would incentivize homeowners to, for example, install an impervious driveway, but they're more of a thank you for doing the right thing. The updated estimated costs for this project can be seen on this slide. They include a one-time investment of $1.2 million and an estimated ongoing cost of approximately $320,000. This includes 2.5 FTEs, which we will be asking for board authorization for during the upcoming budget process. Next slide. We have started our engagement process and are currently forming our Stakeholder Advisory Group, which will represent key interest groups in the county and provide input on the process, rate structure, and outcomes. We will be conducting online surveys and town halls with key constituent groups as well. This slide lays out the overall timeline for the project. The goal per board guidance is to implement the utility during FY24. Since we're billing with the real estate tax bill, we will be proposing a fee for calendar year 23 during the budget process this time next year and adopting it in April of 2023. This is an aggressive timeline and there's lots to do over the next year. Depending on engagement or rate complexities, the timeline has the potential to slip to FY25. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike Moon to wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Tyler. The next steps, as you see here, will be to begin the Phase 2 implementation, which consists of various work elements to include updating the GIS layer to ensure we're capturing all the impervious area on each parcel, finalizing the rate recommendations, working on the billing configuration collaboratively with the Treasurer's Office, and implementing technology tools to manage the utility and developing policies and procedures for the program. The engagement plan is included and will be critical to the project success as we consult with stakeholders. I think it's fair to say, as Mark alluded to earlier when he introduced the presentation, for those customers where the burden is shifting and also to those customers where they haven't been billed in the past, we're apt to see some concerns or some vibration by those customers, and we need to be ready to engage and explain the program. The next steps will be to implement this, as Tyler alluded to, as we're developing the public engagement process and plan as we speak, and we'll be happy to take questions from the board at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moon, and thank you, Ms. Smith, for going through a tremendous amount and a tremendously complicated presentation so quickly at our request, actually my request anyway, so that we could allow the bulk of our time for questions and discussion. Really appreciate that whirlwind tour through a really complex topic and obviously the amount of work that clearly undergirds it. I will open the floor to colleagues. I have a number of questions myself. I think I saw Mr. DeFerranti first, and then Ms. Garvey. We'll go to you.
I do have a question. I also, if you have framing questions to start, that's fine, but I'm going to proceed. So question is about, you mentioned just at the end, Mike, Mr. Moon, that we'll update the GIS to show impervious cover, but also, thinking about the pictures, the 3 slides with the different homes. We have an impervious driveway, but it would look, it's pervious, but it would look impervious from a GIS.
Correct.
And we're registered, of course, with the county, and we follow up there. But is there a process? If someone thinks they've got impervious that is meeting our standards, they think they have pervious that is meeting our standards for pervious cover. that wouldn't be counted in the, the slide 15 and the various square footage amounts. Would you imagine a process for following up to sort of verify and check?
Yeah.
Just because GIS seems like the right overall piece, but I imagine there could be a significant number of questions.
Yeah, and I may turn this over to Tyler, but what's typically done is they do the digitization work through our GIS using the digital automated tool there. But typically, there is an appeal process if people think that they have been slotted or too much impervious area was calculated, especially if it's bumped them up into a higher tier for billing. So haven't fully developed that process at this juncture, but that would be the anticipation. And Tyler, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Thanks, Mike. I would just add that that sort of procedure work will be handled during the implementation phase, where we'll need to coordinate with, for example, our LDA program to make sure we have the data that they have to make sure we're capturing those sorts of nuances, impervious driveways, for example. But then the other piece, I think, is what Mike mentioned, is that there would be a process by which property owners could appeal.
Sure, that's fine. Wasn't trying to get too in the weeds, but I could imagine this being a broad enough issue that would impact a fair number of folks. So I'll yield. I might have another question or two, but I'll yield.
Any other questions on appeal process or things like that? Seeing none? Ms. Garvey, say next.
Yeah, so I sort of know the answer to this question, but I realized if somebody asked me, I couldn't tell them. So of the 539 that haven't been paying for this and suddenly will, why didn't they pay before?
The reason that they didn't pay before is they were tax exempt, and the bill has been on our tax bill, and it's an ad valorem tax. So if they're not billed or tax exempt, no bill goes out to them to recover stormwater fee.
So the tax exempt, I kind of understand. So this is considered a fee, I guess. So
That's
it's
correct.
not really a tax.
Yeah,
So
and-
that's cool.
Yeah, and it does confuse some customers, but I do think the plan at this juncture, it is a fee. It's calculated based on impervious area of the parcels, but it is billed, we plan to still bill it on the real estate bill. So sometimes that does confuse, but I think we'll have to do a good job of education to make sure customers
Yeah,
understand.
of course, thank you. And then are you expecting challenges from this? Because if other places have recently gone to this, that suddenly, I imagine that some of these groups that have been taxes are going to insist that they still shouldn't have to pay anything. That's probably what's going to happen.
We're hopeful we don't get contested. I would say, Tyler alluded to this in some of her comments, there's 19 of the 21 VAMSA jurisdictions have implemented a stormwater utility fee based on impervious areas. So we're kind of lagging as a jurisdiction on that aspect, but because of that, we may be in better stead of not being challenged as readily. So we're hopeful not, but that's always a possibility. So we'll just have to work.
No, thank you. I was just kind of trying to anticipate things a little bit. Thank you. I've got other questions, but I think we probably ought to just
Okay,
keep going around.
great. Yeah, we'll do round first. Mr. Karantonis.
Oh, thank you. I remember that I used to own a property that was, paying that kind of fee. The authority would send me a photo of my home with impervious surface, and I could protest that. Talking about this, so decks are not included as impervious surfaces, right?
That's
As I interpret the slide, is that correct? The slide 8.
It depends on what's, technically, I think that's correct. It would depend on what's below the deck technically, but that's our interpretation at this point.
And so other elements, like, for example, if there are trees in the property, et cetera, in the LDA, for example, we consider trees in the property a reason to give credit to those who left the trees in the property and didn't take them down when they disturbed when they asked for an LDA permit. Here we don't. This is just we want to find what is the impervious surface and apply whatever fee structure we'll end up applying based on, the ERUs.
Yes, I think to answer that specifically, we don't plan to, it's really, trees will be considered as part of the pervious service, so you will get that benefit. But right now, we haven't developed the credit program, but at this point, in keeping it very simple, we don't anticipate giving credits for that type of preservation. But under LDA, as you noted, there is some consideration.
So on slide 23, is there, what makes the single-family home, we talk about single-family residential, single-family homes around Columbia Pike and Douglas Park, et cetera, to be the ones that experience the highest, they're most prominent in the heat map. They're redder than the average.
I think, Mike, I can handle this question. I think some of the reason you see some of those trends is because sometimes the lower assessed value properties, may have a similar footprint. They may be a ranch style, or they may have large patios, and so they are seeing an increase under the utility compared to maybe a lower assessed value in their home compared to some of the other homes in the north, for example.
Okay, I don't want to hog the discussion. I have one on multifamily.
Yeah, if colleagues will indulge me, I wanted to follow, I had the exact same question. And so just to check my understanding, the idea is the taxes of single-family homeowners sort of south of the Pike are perhaps artificially low right now because they're associated with their home values, and that same property value be priced higher in a different part of the county, whereas their consumption or their use or their contributions to the demand on the stormwater infrastructure could be identical. So it's not so much that they're going to pay more as somebody, or they won't pay more under the fee system. It's just that there's going to be a larger jump from what they pay now under the tax system.
There could be, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. I appreciate your asking, Mr. Karantonis.
Yeah, because the elements that contribute to imperviousness, they're not, completely captured through the assessment process today.
At all.
As additional.
Yeah.
But here they're relevant. This is why we see that. Last question is, I understand the discussion on, tiered, capped and tiered versus not. I tend to be a friend of the tiered system, and happy to discuss details. But here on the multifamily properties, the garden apartment treatment. So what would be a good criteria to guide a decision between considering the class versus considering each individually? So you're proposing to consider that as a customer class, take the total of their metrics and divide it by the number of units that are on that. And you're making a good argument that this is a little bit friendlier to these properties, so that we don't overburden those who are lower income, assuming that these properties are housing lower income or moderate and lower income households. Is that the only reason, or are there other?
Let's start, and Tyler may want to layer on. I think you bring up a good question, because that multifamily rate option is a option, as Tyler explained. It doesn't do what we call subsidization outside of the customer class. It does it within and then divides the units, as you explained. So that kind of keeps it, within maybe a logical methodology to approach the rate there. If you wanted to do it per single, if you wanted to do it per, or the same way we're doing non-single family or NSFR, you certainly can do it. Both procedures are justifiable and can be explained. I think it's a matter of, and that's why we teed that up as a policy issue. You have to sort of look at some of the other competing board priorities with some of those type of properties, and you've articulated the missing middle and some of those other goals and objectives. So I think that's why Tyler and the team developed that option. The results. That's what I would offer. But Tyler, do you have something there?
Yeah, I would just add on that the reason we looked at the multifamily residential option was because of the impacts we saw on the garden style apartments, and we were looking for a rate design option that could mitigate those impacts. So that really was the primary driver. So I think from a policy decision, if we were to look at the multifamily residential class, option, that would be, the rationale for adding that.
The only thing I would layer on there just to add is I think in the teams, in the development process of the stormwater utility, they did benchmark other jurisdictions. And Alexandria had a similar type treatment. It's not exactly the same, but when we saw what they were doing with some of the condos, apartments, it gave rise for us having some interest in that area because they have some similar land use. And so I'd add that additional.
And we're certain that there is no legal problem to consider one type of customer a class customer and the other type of customer an individual.
Well, Raf Tellis is on the line. They could speak to that. But we think because you didn't cross-subsidize, doing things within the class of customer it provides a defensible methodology is how I would classify it, that we can, attribute it. If we were just to do it something, that you really couldn't explain, I think that's where we get into maybe a delicate situation there.
So I'd love us to stay on this topic of the multifamily residential customer class, because I know it's an area where staff wanted feedback, and I suspect there are other questions. So, Mr. Dorsey, did you have anything to add on this topic? Maybe we'll.
No, I'm going to take us in a different direction, so
Perfect.
please, let's do this.
Okay. So I think other colleagues wanted to weigh in. One of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit, and I think you all articulated well, both the increased complexity of administration, right, of having this additional class. And I also, one of the things that I am mindful of throughout is if we want this change, which is going to be a serious change, to be well received and understood, clarity is a virtue, right? Beyond ease of administration, it will also, I hope, create greater buy-in among Arlingtonians. So anything that takes us further away from that direction is a downside. I think one of the things, the largest upside I might see would be if we had some assurance, which you've explicitly told us we don't have, that those savings would be passed on to the actual tenants of those apartments, rather than some more or less be realized as a windfall for those property owners relative to other property owners of multifamily residential. And so I just wanted to probe a little bit to ask, is there a universe in which we can legally structure with this class that it's, if you're going to participate in this, or if we're going to assess you as a multifamily residential customer class member, that you'd have to agree in some way to offset that burden for the end user, i.e. the tenant, or that's just sort of beyond what we could structure or require?
I don't know of a way we can require it. We can continue to explore that with our consultant and with the county attorney's office. But Tyler, did you have anything else there that you'd like to share?
No, I don't think I do. We did try to provide some reference on the slide, the multifamily examples that showed what the average rent was for those buildings, and sort of put in context what it would mean per unit when we added the stormwater utility in. But I think, if assuming we have limited options to ensure that those savings are being passed to the tenants, I think that the property owners will find a way through their rent structures to probably recoup those costs.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So we can assume if we don't do that, utilities will go up, but we can't assume if we do that they won't as well. So yeah, I mean, I have to admit that just to sort of give some of the feedback that you all requested, the potential complexity of this is enormous. I think the elegance of the shift from tax to fee, which I think Ms. Garvey noted in her comments, really is, the alignment of hopefully a stronger correlation between what's paid for the system and the burden placed on that system. And to, challenge that even a little bit and create a more complex structure when we actually have no assurance that those savings would be passed on to the folks in our community about who were most concerned of paying an additional burden. It leaves me a little less clear that this is worthy of the enormous amount of complexity that would go into implementing it. So, Ms. Garvey, you wanted to comment or ask questions as well?
I think it's sort of related to this issue, if that's right, it's occurred to me. So of the groups that, there's the small businesses, with the big parking lots. I'm assuming some of them are probably struggling. And I'm assuming probably some of the churches are maybe having a hard time too. Do we have any sort of sense on that? I'm not sure even what to do with it, but I think we may hear a lot from the country clubs, but I think they can manage it, but I'm not so sure about some of, I don't know whether this is something that might push over some small, legacy business or not. I don't know. Do you all, you might not have gotten to that point.
Well, yeah, I think we're going to hear, we've yet to implement, I think we're going to consider potentially there's some development of the credit program that could assist with nonprofits, but it would be, as Tyler alluded to, more of a thank you for maybe a program that they have for education on stormwater, et cetera. We're attuned to the fact that that's a big change for those nonprofits. I think for the businesses, we're gonna wade into the public engagement process and see what we hear, and that's something that we're going to be attuned to. But we don't really have. I think that's something that we can consider also in the timing of this. Distancing, we're hopeful that distancing from the pandemic on implementation somewhat could assist with that matter, but we're gonna try to get good feedback on that through the public engagement process.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
Yeah, so more questions on the multifamily residential per unit option or feedback on that. If there's none, then I'll go to Mr. Dorsey, who's been very patient.
Oh, no. And mine is actually tangential to this. So it's a question about the science. So for whomever can speak to that, if you can get queued up. So as I understand it, the fundamental presumption of all of this is that impervious surface parallel to the ground on a property is driving is a proxy for impact and necessitating this fee structure model. The question as it relates to higher rise buildings, it's my understanding that the taller the building, the more of the impact on wind-driven rain, and certainly the taller of the building, the more you actually have a building facade. And by virtue of how buildings are designed to not let water come in, water that hits a facade of a larger building will have to go somewhere. So the question is there a science way to analyze whether or not the presumption is true that a higher rise building actually has less impact on our stormwater management program?
I would just, I think Raf Tellis may need to help with this one somewhat. I would just tell you a little bit, I think the basic runoff, the runoff to our stormwater system is really just keyed when any developer comes in with their civil engineer or their design engineer. It is predicated upon how much footprint is impervious. And not to get really wonky into the design formulas for the work session, but there is either a coefficient of runoff or there's a curve number typically associated with the degree of imperviousness of that site. And that's key to calculating the amount of runoff that comes out off of that site and the amount of runoff that they may have to detain. So I guess my point at a real simplified level, and I'll turn the complex portion of your question to tell us, but at a real basic foundational point, that is the basic burden calculation onto our stormwater system. Now, to the walls of the high rise, you bring up a point that I would have to refer that to Raf Tellis, but I can tell you from the design standpoint through our site planning process, it's typically the plan view, horizontal digitized, similar to what we're doing in our GIS exercise. But Tyler, you want to turn it over to Raf Tellis to give more?
Sure. Henrietta, do you want to add in anything there?
Good afternoon. I am not aware of science on the particular point that you bring up as a factor in modifying the effect of one property, a high rise, versus one whose impervious area is more horizontal. But your point that there are several factors that influence the particular runoff characteristics of properties is a good one. And I think in this case, impervious area has been repeatedly upheld as having a rational nexus to the demand that properties place upon the system, the stormwater system. And although there are lots of other factors that could be taken into account, they also increase the complexity and the cost of administering the rate structure.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I appreciate those answers. They make sense with what little I understand about, hydrology and water movements. But I suspect, just generally speaking, while this totally makes sense as a way to go, at least in my mind, with current customs and practices, I actually think high-rise buildings are likely being under assessed in terms of their impact, because we haven't actually come to settled science on how to measure it. But it just only stands to reason that the taller the structure, the more you have an ability for that structure to contribute to stormwater impacts. Even if you don't want to count the facades, the fact that you have a taller structure influences wind-blown rain movements, but I think those facades as well are a contributing factor. We just don't quite have a way to measure it yet, but that means that their impact is going under-assessed, and that's an area that I'd like to at least look to the science to guide any future improvements to this.
And I'm sure as well the design of the building, setbacks, slopes, that sort of thing would also, it sounds, perhaps I'm reading too much into Ms. Locklear's comments, but we're also constrained not only by the emerging science, but maybe the case law as well, where we can demonstrate a nexus between features of that building and the demands on the system.
But if we lagged on implementing this, maybe we can lead on that, since we have so many high rises in our community, so.
Thank you. Mr. DeFranti for a second round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to just make sure on the 3 tiers with a cap, that's where I am. You asked a couple of questions, and so I think Mr. Carantonis, but I wanted to make sure I sort of shared that. I think the slides 26 and 27, the multifamily, not to go backward, but the multifamily customer class option, appreciate the pre-briefing I got, but I also want to think that through a little bit more. I do worry about some of the buildings in the West End. I also think implementation clarity is a challenge. I guess I had a question about slide 24, and that's just sort of seeing if I'm understanding the big picture. This is the various entities, Alexandria, Falls Church, et cetera. I guess I had been under the impression that the further out you get, there's more space between homes, so Prince William County kind of makes a little bit of a sense to me, but Fairfax County's stormwater costs are significantly higher than ours, and I'm wondering if you might be able to speak big picture. I don't know whether it's Mr. Moon or Tyler or Ms. Smith, but just why that might be. They might have larger physical structures that would make, and I also think DC, if I'm not mistaken, they had a huge infrastructure that they had to. Is there any ability to talk a little bit to why Fairfax is above us in cost?
Yeah, I mean, Tyler, I've turned over to Tyler, but I think some of this comes down to the size of the program, their funding. Obviously, they have a lot more base. But Tyler, do you want to?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Mike. I think it's the size of the program they're funding. And I think, as we start to look at some of the large infrastructure capital projects in the future and moving our rate to a utility, you'll see you see that the star inches us up a little bit too when we change the to a utility fee. So I think both of those things could impact our rate in the future, but it's based on the size of the program that they're funding.
Yeah, I think Demetra had something to add on.
Yeah, without getting into too much detail, I think it's hard to treat these jurisdictions as though we're precisely apples to apples. Fairfax is a much larger district, but it also has more space for it to impose measures on developers like stormwater detention ponds. The other thing about Fairfax County is that it doesn't, quote unquote, own any of its roads. And Alexandria, and certainly to the greatest extent, Arlington County does. There are only a couple of roads that are owned for purposes of maintenance and stormwater by VDOT. Then in Alexandria, you also have coastal exposure as well. So there's a little bit of, a true up with each of these. But I think it's a relatively demonstrative graphic.
Great. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Gives context, so we're not trying to be too precise. And then I guess I'll be interested in, I do think that the implementation of this with respect to our nonprofits and our churches, there's a whole lot of implementation there that I'm interested in, and I imagine will take some time. I wonder if the size, if smaller budget is of any, if we've thought through the equity implications of that, keeping in mind that all nonprofits and churches are part of our, often, almost always part of our equity response. But do you have any thoughts on implementation there that you could tease out a little bit because this will be a shock to some?
I think, I don't think, first of all, we haven't developed the credit program again, but it sort of crosswalks back to what Board Member Garvey said. We're going to try to be sensitive to what we hear in the nonprofit space. There are some benchmark jurisdictions that have done some things there. I haven't got firsthand knowledge of any that have actually done it on size of budget and to that detail, but there are some different nonprofit benchmark jurisdictions that have done some things in that space that we want to learn more from, not only Raf Tellis, but also hear from our specific nonprofits and get a sense of what the issues are.
Sure, thank you, and appreciate you referencing Ms. Garvey's comments. That's all I have. Thanks, ma'am.
If Ms. Garvey will allow me, I wanted to follow up on a similar point to the one Mr. Ferrante was making. For me, I would so much rather support our nonprofits and faith community in reducing their amount of impervious surface so that their fees are lower than I would look for ways to give them a break while they continue to place the greater burden. And so, Ms. Smith's comments, you did a great job explaining that this is really not about incentivizing different behavior. And you specifically said that rates are not significant enough to induce property owners to make changes to their properties. And I could see, single family owners are going to experience, as you noted, an average of $58 increases. That's really not enough to pull up your patio or change your driveway. But, for religious institutions, the average of their billable increases are, over $1,600 annually. That adds up. It seems to me like there may be some incentives for those institutional payers, which brings me to a question I've asked before and was just teeing up with our planning staff this morning, which is how can we start to think about ways we can support them in reducing their impervious surface? I'll give one example, which is something we've thankfully already done, but many of our religious institutions are home to child care centers. A few years ago, we significantly reduced the parking minimums required of child care centers. But had we not taken that action, you could have had religious centers locked in a situation where they have to pay for large parking lots because our zoning code was forcing them to have large parking lots. And I'm sure there are analogous situations for things we haven't yet tackled. And so, I don't know that we have answers on the table now, but I'd really love to see that be part of our implementation conversations, to really understand for those nonprofits who own their own properties, for those religious institutions who are going to be paying for the first time, what are the obstacles to their changing the amount of impervious surface on their property, whether that's our zoning code or maybe it's just the money, right? And there is perhaps some way that we could create a capital fund to support them in making those changes. Because I do very much agree with Mr. DeFranti's instinct that we want to support those who actually are part of our equity response in other areas. But again, I'd really like to support them in reducing their impact on the system, not just giving them a break on their rate. So I don't know if that's something you've thought about at all. If I can add it kind of to the table for the implementation phase, that would be sufficient for me. But if there are conversations underway or opportunities you might see that you wanted to share now, I'd welcome that too.
The only thing I would add, I think we'll just take that as feedback in the implementation phase. One thing I would point, though, just there is a basic incentive I think it was on slide 16, Tyler pointed out that on those nonprofit classes, 279 of the 539 properties are non-single family residential. So there will be any impervious area they reduce for that almost 50% of those entities will have a direct impact on their bill because of the fee structure itself.
Yeah.
Now, beyond that, in the credit program and what we can develop there, we'll take this as feedback and maybe some, development opportunities there.
Excellent. And please know that I twisted planning staff's arm to talk to you guys about this too, so you don't have to do it on your own. Ms. Garvey, thanks for your patience.
No, I'm actually just right there with you. Could we see slide 38? It just to me was sort of the biggest example. I think that's the one with St. Charles. It's got the picture of the church and the lot. And my question was really quite similar. So, I mean, just look at all that parking lot. If they change that parking lot to pervious, because you can do pervious parking lots, is that correct? Or am I incorrect in that assumption that you can make parking lots pervious with paving or stones or something like that? Is that wrong?
You can, there's a lot of capital cost in converting though.
Okay.
I mean, you have to basically, to make it pervious, you have to construct it from the ground up again. So it is, to have a investment, it would be challenging to incentivize that it'd be significant capital. But that doesn't mean that we can't have some type of process to help.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think we can do, I think it would have to be some type of credit program or grant program, because you can't really do the public property. We couldn't do public projects on their property as private.
Right. Okay. But I was really at the same place. I mean, just looking at that, if it's just that huge parking lot, we don't want to encourage people, we don't want to encourage that huge parking lot.
Yeah.
We can find a way around it. And then a similar question for homeowners. If you were putting an addition on a house and you put in a cistern, say, would that be something you'd get credit for, so that if it runs off the roof and into the cistern and not into the stormwater system, then that wouldn't count to your square footage? Is that correct or not?
That's a
There are jurisdictions that develop those, stormwater. First of all, if you do it as part of a development, typically it's required as part of the LDA program. I'm not sure we want to give credits for what's already required.
Right. Okay.
But if people do it voluntarily, there are jurisdictions that give consideration for credits for that. But I think in the program that we've outlined, the concern that we have, at least with having those type of credits individually for each type of stormwater device, whether it's it could be a tank, it could be a dry well, it could be all sorts of devices, is we have to inventory them, check them, audit them, and the administration of that type of program is pretty heavy. So right now we're trying to, at least the initial go-in is to keep the credit program simplified.
Yep.
But we'll see how the public engagement process works through with stakeholders and come back to you with something there.
Yeah, thank you. No, I totally understand the need to keep it simple.
Yeah.
I was just kind of wondering, I've just been still blown away by the fact you've got the GPS that can kind of tell you everything, or supposedly can. I'm still stuck on that one. Thank you. That was it. I was just kind of following this.
Mr. Karantonis.
Just thanking everybody. This is a very good discussion. To Mr. Dorsey's comments, there is also another thing that very often this conversation is coming. There is a lot of impervious infrastructure that serves different classes of, so there is often said that the impervious infrastructure that supports single-family home neighborhoods is way bigger than the impervious infrastructure that supports multifamily. So, more roads and sidewalks, et cetera. So this compensates a little bit for any other difference in how these buildings capture or repel water into the system. But I wanted a different thing. I would appreciate a map that shows at the end the different classes of customers, how they support the cost of the entire program. You presented maps, heat maps as to who will experience a increase, a decrease, or a flat fee or performance or flat burden compared to the current fee structure. I would see how under the tiered scenario, and how changing our philosophy of how we charge for how that we consider impact now the commanding variable, how the entire stormwater system will be supported by different classes of customers. So how much will single-family homes contribute? How much will the class of customers of high-rise multifamily, et cetera?
I think slide 20, Tyler could speak to this one again, but we could do, if you want to do some sensitivity analysis around different policy assumptions around this kind of transition on how the burden shift, we certainly can do that with Tyler and the team. But this is what we tried to demonstrate in slide 20 on the sanitary tax is where we are today. And the transition will be tiered with the cap, if that's where we head with this, is that's how the burden for at least the 3 major classes. Now, if we, right.
Yes, I understand, I appreciate that, just as a map, so to see.
Oh, the map.
Yeah. I mean, because, this overlays with other considerations that we have here, equity considerations, income considerations, et cetera. This is why I'm saying.
Thanks. Mr. Dorsey.
Sure. Some questions about billing. So since this will be part of real estate tax bill, it's going to be billed semi-annually?
Correct.
That's correct. Yeah.
Is there any way that we could think about smoothing that over the course of a year, particularly for these new classes who will be paying for the first time, is the case of nonprofits and other exempt properties or garden apartments that are going a significant step up? Can we think about alternative ways of allowing them to meet that burden, or is that balanced by a difficulty in administration that you see as being too much to overcome?
Tyler,
Well,
go ahead.
thanks, Mike. We can certainly look at what options there are within billing on the real estate tax bill. We did look at other options to bill, including the water sewer bill, and the third option being the least preferable would be, a new billing system, which we thought was the least favorable given the cost and time to do that. We actually looked at the fact that we were, from an administrative standpoint, having to bill twice a year to be a positive, but I understand your point, Mr. Dorsey, that could be harder for those that have a bill for the first time. So we can certainly look into that with the Treasurer's Office as well to see what options we may have.
Thank you. And since other user fees that we have, water, electricity, if you don't pay, you just get your service cut off. Here, we don't have anything to cut off, so that means, is our collection mechanism lien?
Tyler, that's my understanding. It would be the same process as we do for real estate at that point.
Yes, I think that's the benefit of billing on the real estate tax bill, is that we'll have the benefit of the lien process through the Treasurer's Office.
That's something I would encourage us to really try to see if we can come up with some smoothing mechanisms, particularly as this socializes for the first time. I don't want this in any way to end up putting, nonprofits and vulnerable communities in jeopardy because, all of a sudden this new bill, it's difficult for them to meet in a timely fashion, results in, property judgments against them. That would be, to me, unfortunate. So hopefully we can build up a robust enough program that we can keep people out of jeopardy of losing property as a result of this. Going back to Ms. Crystal's comment about hoping that the savings can be passed through to tenants, and while I associate myself with that desire, I doubt there's a whole lot that we can do there. But it does strike me that even if we can't require it, it might be useful for us to talk about here, and certainly when we implement, that for the garden apartment communities who are experiencing such a huge increase, I presume mostly because of surface parking, that they may think about, instead of passing through to all tenants that increase in cost, that they maybe think about adding that to the burden for what people pay to park in those communities, so that can at least be equitable in terms of impact and who pays in those micro areas. Don't know if we can, I doubt we can mandate that as a government, but certainly I would want to socialize that to them, because that would be a fair way of doing it, and could lead to Ms. Garvey's desire that people see reduced parking demand and then they're repurposing that space in a pervious manner because they don't need it for parking anymore. That would be the best result overall. So, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just to note, to your point about the billing, that I think the other virtue of billing with the water sewer rate is that, again, this is, as you said, it's a little different because you're not getting the service quite as directly, but it should be associated with those services, right? This is about a utility in which we all participate, and you have a burden on the system, whether that burden is taking some amount of clean water into your home or displacing some amount of runoff into the system. So I think that's really attractive. And I think, Ms. Smith, I can't even imagine the complexity of creating a new billing structure. So I'll just associate myself with Mr. Dorsey's interest in, I think there would be a couple of potential benefits to tying it to the water sewer bills as well. Any other questions? All right, well, I'll do my level best to summarize what I think I've heard in reaction to some of your questions. I know Mr. DeFrenti, was very helpful that you specifically noted your support for the base charge with cap proposal. I'm supportive as well. We didn't talk about that in great depth, but I assume that's because I think we all think this is thoughtful. And that long tail, I'll say I am perfectly comfortable with it. I know one of the things that really irks a lot of folks in our community is that there are very large homes being built and paying the same stormwater rate. So from a fairness perspective, that long tail, I think I'm perfectly comfortable with it too. So seeing support for that. I think we heard some mixed feedback on that, the multifamily rate with the per unit option. I don't know that we're going to have anything conclusive to say. I think we all were interested in the idea of tenants, which I would include retail tenants as well as residential tenants, because that was Ms. Garvey's point. I think most of our small businesses probably rent their space rather than being their property owner, but some will be property owners. So there's definitely some interest in thinking about those impacts, whether we'll be limited in being able to legally do it, but I think that's probably our greatest area of interest. And then with regard to the credit program, I think there is certainly support for what we can do to give more meaningful support for real changes to permeability. I know the credit program really doesn't seem set up to do that. But recognizing as well that it's required by law. If we can use that requirement to further some of those goals, that would be great. If not, and again, speaking for myself, I think really trying to think about how do we identify and then address the obstacles for our institutional payers, especially to reduce their amount of permeability. So anything else to add, anything I've missed on especially those key areas of feedback? Does that give you all what you need? Were there more things you were hoping the board would opine on today? Because we're always happy to opine. We can give you a move into the next phase.
Ms. Crystal?
Yes. Oh, please,
No, I'll just say, I think this is just really good work, and I really appreciate it and really important to do. I had no idea how sort of far off base we are. We're on this. I should have thought about it, but I hadn't. And on the credit program, I get that, that's not a focus, and this isn't meant to be an incentive program, but it seems to me with the credit, we can make this cost recovery program, there may be some ways to tweak the credits as we get into it more. Not now and down the line, but to make that really a way of finding ways to incentivize or support individuals and institutions to do what we would like them to do. So that's just occurred to me listening to that might be able to morph into that a little bit more. That's it. Thank you really much. I appreciate it.
Great, fantastic. Well, to get a little esoteric for a minute, I don't know if anybody else in their public policy careers or engineering careers has come across that famous study of the primates that when you trigger their sense of unfairness, it enrages them, and how very human that is when we feel like we are being treated unfairly. And I know that's something that's come up so often as we've had conversations with community members in the face of significant stormwater impacts and floodings to their property. It's just this real sense that everyone should pay their fair share. And so I really would classify all of this incredibly extensive work that our teams have done, again, across departments with support from the subject matter experts also at Ref-Telus, really have been a big effort to do this fairly. And I think that's really worth doing as we try to solve this major challenge of adapting to an environment with significantly increased storms. So we thank you very much, and we'll look forward, I think I speak for all of us in saying we'll look forward to following this over the next year and a half or so as we make our way towards implementation. So thanks again. We are moving next into a closed meeting. So I'm going to make the following motion. which is that the county board convene a closed meeting as authorized by Virginia Code Section 2.2, 3711A3 for discussion regarding the acquisition and disposition of real property for public purpose, where the discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect our bargaining position or our negotiating strategy. All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, we will move now into closed session. Thank you so much. Public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under Chapter 37, Title 2.2 of the Code of Virginia, and 2, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting was convened were heard, discussed, or considered by the board. Do I have a second? Seconded by Mr. Dorsey. The clerk will call our roll.
Ms. Crystal?
Aye.
Mr. Dorsey? Mr. Carantonis?
Yes.
Ms. Garvey? Mr. DeFerranti?
Yes.
All right. I believe that we are unanimous in our assent. Thank you all so much. We are adjourned. We'll see you next Tuesday, the 8th, for our planning work plan work session.